The transport shuttle descended through the pale lavender clouds of Varath with the smooth patience of a machine that had performed the maneuver 1,000 times before. Rail Sovos watched the city grow beneath him through the curved window, trying very hard not to think about the fact that he had been on this planet for exactly 72 hours and had already violated at least 3 diplomatic customs he didn't know existed. Varath's capital stretched across the valley like a field of crystalline flowers. Towers of translucent stone spiraled upward, reflecting the afternoon light into soft ribbons that drifted through the sky. Between them moved silent aerial platforms and long, floating walkways, where elegant figures walked with the calm dignity of people who had never once slipped on wet pavement. Rail adjusted the collar of his ambassador's coat. "Translator," he muttered quietly, "remind me again, what is the correct way to greet the Queen?" A small device on his collar beeped politely. "According to Varathian royal protocol," the translator replied in its calm artificial voice, "you must bow precisely 22 degrees, maintain eye contact for 3 seconds, and avoid showing your teeth." Rail blinked. "Avoid showing my teeth? Yes. That seems like a strange rule. Varathians historically associate exposed teeth with aggressive hunting animals." Rail sighed. "So smiling is illegal." "Incorrect," the translator replied. "Smiling is acceptable if performed with lips closed." "Good," Rail muttered. "Because if I have to stop smiling entirely, people will start asking questions." The shuttle settled gently onto the palace landing platform. Outside, the royal palace rose like a living mountain of pale stone and glowing glass. Its enormous archways curved upward like the ribs of some ancient cosmic creature, and faint energy currents shimmered along the walls like distant lightning frozen in place. Rail stepped out onto the platform and immediately noticed the guards. They stood in perfect stillness along the walkway, their armor smooth and metallic with soft blue lights tracing along the edges. Their long ears rose gracefully from their heads, giving them a strangely elegant appearance despite the enormous energy spears they carried. The captain of the guard inclined his head slightly. "Ambassador Rail Sovos." Rail performed what he hoped was a 22-degree bow. It might have been 25, possibly 30. The translator didn't complain, which he decided to interpret as success. "I appreciate the welcome," Rail said politely. The captain studied him for a moment. "You are the first human ambassador to enter the royal throne hall." Rail nodded. "Well," he said, "let's try to make it a memorable experience for all the right reasons." The guard did not laugh. They began walking through the palace. The corridors were enormous and impossibly quiet. Light drifted through the air in slow-moving orbs that illuminated the polished floors. Occasionally, a servant or advisor passed by, each one pausing to stare at the human visitor with open curiosity. Rail kept walking while trying not to look like someone who had absolutely no idea what he was doing. After several minutes, they reached the throne hall. The doors alone were taller than a starship. When they opened, Rail felt the atmosphere change instantly. Thousands of Varathian nobles stood in silent rows across the massive chamber. Floating lanterns drifted above them like calm galaxies, casting gentle light across the marble floor. At the far end of the hall stood the throne, and upon it sat Queen Durin. Even from across the enormous chamber, Rail could see why her reputation had traveled across half the galaxy. She looked almost human, yet not entirely. Her silver hair flowed across her shoulders like liquid moonlight, and her long ears curved elegantly behind her head. Her expression was calm, controlled, impossible to read. Rail began walking toward the throne. Every step echoed through the hall. His mind reviewed every diplomatic instruction he had studied during the long journey from Earth. "Do not speak first. Do not move too quickly. Do not panic." Rail reached the center of the chamber and stopped. He bowed carefully. 22 degrees, possibly. For a moment, the entire hall remained perfectly still. Then something strange happened. At the far end of the chamber, a small door opened. Light footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Rael barely had time to glance sideways before a small figure burst into the hall at full speed. A young Varathian girl. She sprinted past several shocked guards, ran the entire length of the throne chamber, and headed directly toward him like a tiny comet with very determined legs. Rael blinked. "Oh no," he murmured quietly. The girl reached him, grabbed the back of his coat with both hands, and immediately hid behind him. Rael froze. The girl peeked out cautiously from behind his side. "Don't move," she whispered. Rael slowly looked around the hall. Thousands of nobles stared at him. The guards looked like statues that had forgotten how to breathe. Even the palace advisors appeared completely stunned. Rael cleared his throat carefully. "Well," he said quietly to no one in particular, "this seems like a very important cultural moment." Behind him, the small girl tightened her grip on his coat. And across the vast throne hall, Queen Duren watched the entire scene without changing her expression. Rael Sovos had experienced many forms of silence before. There was the silence of space beyond a ship's hull, the silence of diplomatic meetings where everyone waited for someone else to make the first mistake, and the silence that followed when a politician realized their microphone had been on the entire time. But the silence inside the Varathian throne hall was something else entirely. It felt ancient. It felt ceremonial, and unfortunately it was currently centered on him. Behind Rael, the small pair of hands gripping his coat tightened slightly. The girl pressed closer, as if he were a perfectly normal piece of palace furniture that had always existed for this purpose. Rael did the only reasonable thing he could think of. He stood very still and tried not to accidentally cause an international incident. After several long seconds, he leaned his head slightly to the side and whispered quietly behind him. "Hello?" The girl did not answer. He tried again. "I'm Ambassador Rael Sovos. I represent Earth, a planet known mostly for its oceans, its music, and its long history of making awkward diplomatic situations worse." There was a small pause, then a quiet voice behind him whispered, "Don't tell them I'm here." Rael blinked. He glanced at the enormous throne hall filled with thousands of staring nobles. "Well," he whispered back gently, "that might be slightly difficult at the moment." The girl peeked around his side for half a second before retreating again. "They were going to make me stand in the ceremony." Rael nodded slowly. "Yes," he said sympathetically. "Ceremonies are dangerous like that." Across the hall, several palace scholars had begun whispering urgently to one another. Their robes shimmered with faint holographic threads that shifted colors whenever they moved, making them look like a group of extremely nervous walking constellations. One elderly advisor leaned toward another. She chose sanctuary. The other advisor looked pale. That has not happened in generations. Rael caught the words and immediately wished he hadn't. He spoke quietly into his collar. "Translator, what does chose sanctuary mean?" The device beeped softly. Cultural explanation. In Varathian tradition, when a royal child instinctively selects an individual as protection, it is considered a declaration of spiritual trust. Rael stared straight ahead. "That sounds important." "Yes." "How important?" "Historically, such events have influenced diplomatic alliances, royal marriages, and in one case the founding of an entire city." Rael closed his eyes briefly. "Of course it has." Behind him, the girl tugged gently on his sleeve. "You're warm." Rael nodded. "That's because humans are mostly water and bad decisions." The girl leaned slightly to the side and studied him again. Her long ears twitched with curiosity. "You're not from here." "Correct. You're strange." That has also been noted. A few guards near the front of the hall exchanged uncertain looks. One of them appeared to be fighting very hard not to laugh, which Rael appreciated more than he could properly express. Meanwhile, the palace advisors had formed a small cluster of quiet panic. "This is highly symbolic," one whispered. "We cannot interrupt," said another. "But the ambassador cannot remain there indefinitely." Rael heard that part and raised a finger. "I would just like to clarify," he called politely. That remaining here indefinitely was not part of my original schedule. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. The girl behind him seemed pleased with this development. She stepped slightly to the side, though her hand still held the back of his coat like a safety tether. Rael finally turned enough to see her properly. She looked about 8 years old. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders, and her long ears curved gently upward in the distinctive Varathian shape. Her large eyes studied him with the intense curiosity only children seemed capable of. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lethira, that's a beautiful name." She shrugged as if this information was not particularly important. "You smell like machines." "That's starship fuel," Rael said proudly. "Very fashionable where I come from." For the first time the girl smiled. The tension in the hall shifted slightly. At the far end of the chamber, Queen Durin still sat upon the throne. Her gaze had not left them. Rael became aware of it like gravity. Slowly, the queen rose. The movement was calm, controlled, and immediately commanded the entire hall's attention. Her silver robes flowed around her like drifting light as she descended the steps of the throne. Every noble stepped aside as she approached. Rael stood very still. Behind him, Lethira grabbed his coat again. "Don't let them take me back to the ceremony," she whispered. Rael sighed quietly. "Well," he murmured, "I have been ambassador for 3 days." He glanced down at the small princess. "Apparently today we begin my career as a professional hiding place." The queen stopped a few steps away from them. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved from the ambassador to the small hand gripping his coat. The entire palace seemed to hold its breath. Rael cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I believe I may have accidentally adopted someone." Queen Durin stopped a few steps away from them. The distance between the throne and where Rael stood had seemed enormous only moments ago. Now it felt very small. The queen's presence carried a quiet gravity that pulled every eye in the hall toward her without effort. Rael suddenly became very aware that he was standing in the center of a 1,000-year-old palace, with a small alien princess, gripping his coat like an emergency escape handle. The queen's gaze moved calmly from Rael's face to the small hand holding the back of his coat. Her expression remained almost perfectly unreadable. Behind Rael, Lethira whispered, "Don't move." Rael murmured under his breath, "I had no intention of moving." For several long seconds no one spoke. The throne hall felt as if it had turned into a statue carved from silence. Then Queen Durin said softly, "Lethira." The princess slowly leaned sideways, peeking around Rael's arm, her ears lowered slightly. "Hello, mother." Rael gave a small nod toward the queen. "Your Majesty." The queen's eyes rested on him for a moment, measuring something invisible. Rael had met many powerful leaders before, presidents, admirals, planetary governors. But this was different. Durin watched with the calm patience of someone who understood that time itself usually cooperated with her decisions. Her voice remained gentle. "You entered the throne hall willingly." The princess shrugged a little. "I ran." "Yes," the queen said. "I noticed." Several advisors in the hall quietly shifted their weight as if uncertain whether laughing would be considered treason. Rael cleared his throat. "If it helps," he offered, "the entrance was extremely impressive." The princess nodded proudly. "I ran very fast." "You did," Rael said. "I barely had time to panic." A few guards near the walls coughed suspiciously, which Rael suspected was the Varathian version of suppressed laughter. Queen Durin studied the two of them again. "Lethira," she said, "you have not entered this hall in more than one cycle." Rael whispered quietly to his translator, "What's a cycle?" "Approximately 14 months, the device replied. Rael blinked. He glanced down at the small princess. "That's a long time to avoid meetings." Lethira crossed her arms. "They are boring." "That is a universal diplomatic truth," Rael admitted. She looked at him with growing approval. The queen's gaze sharpened slightly. "And yet," she continued calmly, "today you ran the entire length of the palace to hide behind someone you met 3 seconds ago." Lethira pointed at Rael. He looked safe. The throne hall reacted like someone had quietly dropped a meteor into the room. Several scholars whispered urgently. The instinct of sanctuary, the child has chosen. The implications, Rael raised a finger slightly. If we are about to discuss implications, he said carefully, I would like to request a brief delay while I fully understand what I've accidentally done. An elderly advisor stepped forward nervously. Ambassador Sovos, the princess selecting you as sanctuary carries cultural significance. How much significance? Rael asked. The advisor hesitated. Historically, it has influenced treaties, royal guardianship arrangements, and in one instance the beginning of a religious movement. Rael stared at him. Please tell me the religious movement was small. The advisor looked uncertain. It lasted 2 centuries. Rael closed his eyes briefly. Behind him, Lethira tugged his sleeve. What's a religion? Rael sighed quietly. Something I very much hope we are not starting today. The princess stepped out from behind him slightly now, though she still kept one hand on his coat as if the universe might remove him if she let go. She studied the small translator device clipped to his collar. What is that? It helps me understand your language, Rael said. She leaned closer. Does it understand you? Sometimes. The princess pointed at one of the glowing buttons. What happens if I press this? Rael answered quickly. Probably nothing good. Lethira pressed it immediately. The translator beeped and suddenly announced in perfectly clear Varathian, the human ambassador ENJOYS small round bread products. Rael blinked. He looked down at the device. That was supposed to be the diplomatic clarification button. Several guards lost their composure entirely and began laughing. Even a few nobles allowed quiet smiles to appear. Lethira grinned proudly. You're funny. I assure you, Rael replied, that was completely accidental. Across from them, Queen Duren watched the moment carefully. The laughter, the child's smile, the human ambassador awkwardly adjusting a malfunctioning translator. For the first time, the queen's expression shifted ever so slightly. Not a full smile, but close. She stepped closer. The entire hall grew quiet again. Her gaze moved to Rael. You appear to have achieved something remarkable. Rael straightened slightly. With respect, Your Majesty, he said, my current strategy consists mainly of standing still and trying not to make things worse. The queen studied him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her daughter. Lethira was still holding the ambassador's coat, still standing beside him, still smiling. And the queen finally said softly, perhaps that strategy is working. The throne hall slowly began to breathe again, though the atmosphere remained fragile, like a delicate instrument that had not yet decided whether to play music or explode. Rael stood where he was, aware that several thousand Varathians were still watching him, as if he had just performed an unexpected miracle using only a coat and a confused expression. Princess Lethira had not moved away. Her hand still rested firmly on the back of his coat, which Rael now suspected had officially become the most politically sensitive piece of clothing on the planet. Queen Duren studied the two of them quietly. Her silver hair reflected the floating lights drifting through the chamber, giving her an almost celestial presence. But what held Rael's attention was not her elegance. It was the calm curiosity in her eyes. Lethira, the queen said gently. The princess looked up. Yes, mother, you chose this human as sanctuary. Lethira nodded. Yes. The queen's gaze moved briefly to Rael again. Why? The princess seemed to think very carefully about the answer. Her long ears tilted slightly as she considered the enormous philosophical weight of the question. Finally, she pointed at Rael. He looked confused. Rael blinked. That's the official reason. The princess nodded with confidence. Confused people are usually honest. A murmur spread through the hall. Several scholars began whispering urgently again. The child speaks instinctively. The ancient principle of transparent spirit. Rael raised a finger. Just to clarify, he said politely, I was confused because I arrived 3 days ago, and your palace contains 17 different types of doors that open in 17 different directions. One nearby guard failed to contain a short laugh. The tension softened slightly. Queen Duren walked slowly around Rael, observing the situation from another angle. Her movement was graceful, controlled, but there was something thoughtful behind it, like a scientist observing an unexpected phenomenon. She stopped beside her daughter. "You have refused to attend court for one full cycle," she said softly. Lethira shrugged. "They talk too much." Rael nodded immediately. "That is also a universal diplomatic issue." The princess brightened slightly. "You agree with me?" "I have attended 12 interplanetary negotiations," Rael replied. "Half of them could have been replaced with one very clear sentence and a good lunch." One of the advisors gasped quietly as if Rael had committed a minor philosophical crime. Lethira leaned closer to Rael again, now openly curious. "What planet are you from?" "Earth." "What is it like?" Rael thought for a moment. "It has oceans, forests, cities, and people who argue passionately about the correct way to prepare fried potatoes." The princess frowned slightly. "What are potatoes?" Rael smiled. "An important part of human civilization." She accepted this explanation immediately. The queen's voice returned, calm but thoughtful. "You did not attempt to move away when she chose you." Rael shrugged lightly. "I assumed moving quickly in a room full of armed royal guards would send the wrong message." Several guards nodded quietly as if this had been a wise survival decision. "And yet," the queen continued, "you also spoke to her without hesitation." Rael glanced down at the princess beside him. "Well, when a child hides behind you during a very large ceremony, ignoring them feels rude." Lethira tugged his sleeve again. "You're tall, yes. Can humans see farther because of that?" "No, but we like to pretend we can." The princess seemed delighted by this. Nearby, the palace scholars were now arguing quietly about the deeper implications of the moment. Several ancient cultural texts had been summoned onto hovering holographic panels that floated in the air above them. Rael noticed one panel displaying a translation. "Sanctuary selection, ancient Varathian tradition." He pointed at it. "That looks serious." One scholar nodded gravely. "It is among our oldest customs." "What normally happens after the child chooses sanctuary?" Rael asked. The scholar hesitated. "There is discussion." "How much discussion?" "Historically, several days." Rael looked up at the enormous throne hall. "Excellent," he muttered. "I look forward to my new career as ceremonial furniture." Lethira tilted her head. "What is furniture?" Rael thought for a moment. "Something people rely on more than they expect." The princess smiled again. Across from them, Queen Duren watched this small exchange with quiet intensity. Something had clearly changed in the atmosphere of the room. The tension that had once gripped the hall had softened, replaced by something stranger. Curiosity. Uncertainty, perhaps even a small amount of hope. The queen finally spoke again. "Ambassador Sovos." Rael straightened slightly. "Yes, your majesty." Her gaze remained steady. "My daughter has not laughed in this hall for over a year." Rael glanced at Lethira. She was still smiling faintly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said carefully, "I would like to claim that was part of my diplomatic strategy, but I suspect the translator's bread announcement deserves most of the credit." A faint ripple of laughter moved through the nobles again. The queen did not laugh, but her expression softened. Lethira tugged Rael's coat once more. "Are you staying here?" Rael hesitated. "I was planning to." She nodded firmly. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The princess leaned closer and whispered as if revealing an important secret. "Because now you're my hiding place." The throne hall had changed. It had not grown quieter or louder, but the nature of the silence was different now. At first it had been the kind of silence that follows a shock. Now it was the kind that appears when thousands of people realize they are witnessing something that may later be written in history books. Rael Sovos stood very carefully in the center of that silence. Princess Lethira still held the back of his coat. Rail had begun to suspect that if he moved even slightly too quickly, 3 separate groups of palace scholars might faint. Queen Duren regarded them with the thoughtful stillness of someone examining a complex puzzle that had just assembled itself without permission. "Lethira," she said calmly, "release the ambassador." The princess looked up at Rael, then at her mother. She did not release the coat. No. Several advisors inhaled sharply. Rael coughed quietly. "Well," he said gently, "that was very clear." The queen did not appear offended. Instead, she studied her daughter with careful attention. "You understand what sanctuary means?" "Yes. And yet you remain." Lethira nodded and tugged Rael's coat slightly, as if confirming that it was still functioning properly as a hiding device. Rael whispered down to her, "Just for the record, I normally charge extra for security services." She ignored him. Across the hall, the palace scholars had now activated several floating displays that hovered in the air like translucent windows. Ancient Varathian texts glowed across them in shifting silver symbols. One scholar spoke nervously. "Your Majesty, the ancient doctrine states that when a royal child chooses sanctuary—" "Yes," the queen interrupted calmly. "I am familiar with our own doctrine." The scholar bowed quickly. "Of course." Rael glanced at the glowing texts. "Translator," he whispered. The device hummed softly. "Translation in progress." A moment later, a line of words appeared in small holographic letters beside him. "The child who chooses sanctuary reveals the path of trust." Rael stared at the sentence. "Well," he muttered, "that seems extremely important for something that happened because I looked confused." Lethira looked up at him. "You still look confused." "That's because this appears to be escalating." The princess seemed satisfied with that answer. One of the older advisors stepped forward slowly. His robes shimmered with ancient ceremonial circuitry, tiny lights flowing through the fabric like quiet rivers. "Ambassador Sovos," he said respectfully, "the princess's instinct carries meaning beyond politics." Rael raised an eyebrow. "I was hoping it might carry snacks." The advisor blinked. "Snacks?" "Yes," Rael said. "Diplomacy is much easier when people are eating." Several guards along the wall exchanged quiet glances. The advisor seemed uncertain whether this was wisdom or nonsense. Queen Duren turned her gaze toward Rael again. "You treat this moment lightly." Rael considered the question. "I treat most moments lightly," he said. "Heavy moments tend to fall on people unexpectedly." The queen studied him for several seconds. Behind him, Lethira whispered, "You talk strangely." "That's because I'm human." "That explains it." Rael nodded gravely. "It usually does." One of the floating displays shifted suddenly as the palace archives finished retrieving additional records. The text expanded into a long historical account that scrolled slowly through the air. A younger scholar gasped. "There have only been 6 sanctuary selections in recorded Varathian history." Another scholar added nervously, "and in 4 of those cases the chosen individual became a permanent royal protector." Rael slowly turned his head toward them. "I'm sorry." The scholar hesitated. "Yes. Did you say permanent?" The scholar nodded, "in a ceremonial sense." Rael looked down at Lethira. "Are you planning something long-term here?" The princess shrugged. "You're comfortable. That is not normally a qualification for royal positions." She tugged the coat again. "It is now." Rael sighed. He looked toward the queen. "I would just like to confirm that my diplomatic mission did not include being adopted by the royal family." Several nobles attempted not to laugh again. Queen Duren stepped forward. The movement silenced the hall once more. She stopped directly in front of them and looked down at her daughter. "You trust him?" "Yes." "You do not trust the court." Lethira's ears lowered slightly. "They always watch." The queen's expression softened just a fraction. "They are watching now." Lethira nodded, "but he's confused." Rael raised a finger. "Still true." The princess leaned closer to him. "Confused people don't pretend." Rael opened his mouth to respond, then paused. He had spent years learning the delicate language of diplomacy. where every word carried hidden weight. But the child's reasoning was painfully simple and strangely difficult to argue with. The queen looked up at Rael again. Her voice was quieter now. My daughter has not trusted anyone outside our family since the palace attack last year. The hall grew still. Rael felt the tone change immediately. Oh, he said softly. Lethira looked down at the floor. Rael crouched slightly so his voice would reach her more gently. Well, he said, in my experience the best way to rebuild trust is slowly. She looked at him again. How slow? Rael thought for a moment. About the speed of someone standing in the middle of a throne hall while a child holds their coat. The princess smiled again, and across the chamber, Queen Duren watched that smile very carefully. For several minutes after the queen spoke, no one in the throne hall seemed entirely certain what to do next. The ceremony that had been planned with months of precision had quietly dissolved into something far stranger, an unplanned moment balanced between tradition, childhood instinct, and a human ambassador who was beginning to suspect his job description had changed without warning. Rael Sovos slowly straightened from his slight crouch beside the princess. Lethira still held his coat, not tightly now, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the coat belonged to her. Across the hall, the scholars had formed a new cluster around their floating archives. Lines of glowing text scrolled through the air as they searched through centuries of historical records. Rael glanced toward them. Let me guess, he said quietly to no one in particular. You're looking for instructions. One of the scholars nodded gravely. Yes. Have you found any? The scholar hesitated. No, Rael exhaled slowly. That seems consistent with how my week has been going. A few guards along the walls quietly smiled again. Princess Lethira looked up at him. What is a week? 7 days, Rael replied. She frowned. That sounds long. Not as long as some diplomatic meetings. She seemed to accept that explanation. Nearby, the chief historian cleared his throat. Your Majesty, he said cautiously, according to the ancient records, the sanctuary selection indicates a bond of instinctive trust. Queen Duren stood near the center of the hall, her posture still elegant, her gaze thoughtful. Yes, she said. The historian continued carefully. In previous eras, the chosen individual was sometimes granted temporary guardianship privileges within the palace. Rael slowly turned his head toward him. I'm sorry. The historian looked nervous. Yes. Did you just say guardianship? The historian nodded. Symbolic guardianship. Rael rubbed his forehead. Symbolic things tend to become real very quickly in politics. Behind him, Lethira tugged his coat again. Does that mean you stay? Rael looked down at her. That depends. On what? He glanced toward the queen. On whether your mother thinks this is a terrible idea. The princess followed his gaze. Queen Duren had been watching them quietly throughout the exchange. Her voice was calm when she spoke. My daughter rarely makes decisions based on fear. Rael nodded. That seems like a good trait. She ran through a room filled with guards to reach you. Yes, Rael said. I noticed that part. And you did not step away. Rael considered that. Well, he said honestly, there were several armed soldiers nearby. I suspected stepping away quickly might create a misunderstanding. The queen studied him for a moment. That was wise. Rael gave a small shrug. Mostly instinct. Lethira leaned around him slightly, studying her mother. Are you angry? The queen shook her head slowly. No. The princess looked surprised. Really? Really? Several advisors shifted uneasily as if the calmness itself made them nervous. One of them spoke up. Your Majesty, the court may interpret this event as a declaration of spiritual alignment. Rael turned toward the advisor. That sounds extremely official. The advisor nodded. It is. Rael sighed. Well, he said, if anyone asks, I would like to officially declare that my alignment is currently trying not to make things worse. This time, the laughter in the hall was easier. Even a few nobles allowed quiet smiles to appear. Lethira tugged his sleeve again. Do humans always talk like that? Like what? Like they're confused but also joking. Rael thought for a moment. Yes, she nodded approvingly. I like it. Across the chamber, the chief historian activated another ancient archive. A holographic sculpture formed in the air above them, a glowing recreation of a long-forgotten moment from Varath's past. A small child stood beside a tall, armored warrior. The child held the warrior's cloak. Rael squinted at the image. That looks familiar. The historian nodded slowly. It is the third recorded sanctuary event. What happened afterward? The historian looked slightly uncomfortable. The warrior remained within the royal court for the rest of his life. Rael froze. I see. The princess tilted her head. That seems nice. Rael looked down at her. Nice for who? For you. Rael laughed quietly. That remains to be determined. Queen Duren stepped forward again. The floating archives dimmed slightly as everyone's attention returned to her. She stopped in front of Rael. For a moment she simply observed the strange scene. Her daughter beside a human ambassador, palace scholars hovering around ancient records, guards pretending not to be amused. Finally she said quietly, Ambassador Sovos. Yes, Your Majesty, my court does not know what to do with this moment. Rael nodded. That makes two of us. Lethira tugged his coat again. You're still staying. Rael looked down at her. Are you sure? She nodded firmly. Yes. He looked back toward the queen. Queen Duren's expression softened slightly. And for the first time since the ceremony had begun, the queen allowed a small, unmistakable smile. Ambassador, she said calmly, it appears my daughter has made a decision. Rael sighed softly. Yes, he said, I'm beginning to notice that. The throne hall did not return to its original ceremony. Instead, it slowly transformed into something far more unusual. A gathering of nobles, scholars, guards, and one very patient human ambassador, who had apparently become the center of a centuries-old cultural event without meaning to. Rael Sovos stood quietly while the scholars finished their endless consultations with ancient records. The floating archives dimmed and brightened like cautious stars as new information appeared. Princess Lethira had finally released his coat. For approximately 3 seconds, then she had taken hold of his sleeve instead. Rael decided this counted as progress. Across the chamber, Queen Duren watched the court's reaction with calm authority. Her earlier unreadable expression had softened into something more thoughtful, not amused exactly, but no longer distant. One of the senior advisors finally stepped forward again. Your Majesty, he said carefully, after reviewing the historical doctrine, the court believes the sanctuary selection should be recognized. Rael raised an eyebrow. That sounds official. The advisor nodded. It is. And what exactly does recognition involve? The advisor hesitated. Traditionally, the chosen individual becomes a trusted guest of the royal household. Rael nodded slowly. That sounds manageable. Additionally, the advisor continued, they are permitted unrestricted presence within the palace. Rael nodded again. Also manageable. The advisor looked slightly uncomfortable. And the princess may request their company when she feels threatened. Rael looked down at Lethira. She was watching him carefully. He sighed. Well, he said gently, I suppose I've been promoted from ambassador to portable hiding place. The princess smiled proudly. Queen Duren stepped forward once more, her voice calm but carrying across the enormous chamber. The court will accept the sanctuary bond. A quiet murmur spread through the nobles. It was not shock now, but something closer to agreement. The queen's gaze moved to Rael. Ambassador Sovos, do you object? Rael considered the question honestly. 3 days ago he had arrived expecting formal meetings, carefully negotiated treaties, and polite diplomatic dinners. Instead, he had accidentally become the trusted shelter of an alien princess. He looked down at Lethira again. She met his eyes with the complete certainty only children seemed capable of. You're staying, she said. Rael chuckled softly. Yes, he admitted. It seems I am. The princess nodded as if this outcome had been obvious from the beginning. Queen Duren observed the moment carefully. My daughter has avoided this hall for over a year, she said quietly. Rael nodded. So I've heard, and today she entered it willingly. He glanced down at the princess again. Well, he said gently, sometimes people just need to know there's somewhere safe to stand. The queen studied him for a long moment. I believe, she said slowly, that your people call this instinct trust. Rael smiled slightly. Yes. Lethira tugged his sleeve. Does Earth have palaces? A few. Do children hide behind ambassadors there too? Rael thought for a moment. Not usually. She frowned. That seems like a mistake. Rael laughed quietly. I'll recommend the idea when I get home. One of the scholars approached with a small glowing crystal tablet. Ambassador Sovos, he said respectfully, the sanctuary event must be recorded. Rael nodded. Please make sure to include the part where the translator announced my love for bread. Several guards laughed again. The scholar smiled politely. It will be noted. Queen Durin stepped closer, stopping only a few steps away from Rael and her daughter. For a moment the vast hall felt almost peaceful. You arrived here to build trust between our worlds, the queen said. Rael nodded. That was the plan. You have done so in a way no negotiation could have achieved. He rubbed the back of his neck. I assure you, your majesty, none of this was intentional. That, the queen replied softly, may be why it worked. Lethira stepped slightly in front of him now, no longer hiding. But she remained close enough that her shoulder brushed his coat. Rael noticed something then. When the princess looked at the throne hall now, she no longer looked afraid. She simply looked curious. He leaned down slightly. Feeling brave. She nodded. Yes, good, he said, because I'm still learning how all this works. The princess smiled. You can stay confused. That's lucky, Rael said. I'm very good at that. Queen Durin turned toward the court. The ceremony will conclude. The nobles bowed slightly, but the queen's final words were directed toward Rael. Ambassador Sovos, welcome to Varath. Rael looked around the great hall once more, the glowing lights, the ancient palace, the court that had just accepted him in the most unexpected way possible. Then he looked down at the princess beside him. Well, he said quietly, this diplomatic mission turned out to be far more interesting than expected. Lethira tugged his sleeve again. That's because you're my hiding place. Rael smiled. And this time, standing in the center of the Varathian throne hall, he no longer felt like a confused visitor. He felt like someone who had just found the